Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and today is a special episode in the sense that a couple of weeks ago we covered the US-China rivalry and where India fits in and how India is looking at its own competition with China, what it's trying to do. And that was an amazing episode with Dr. Tanvi Madan. If you haven't heard that, I would highly recommend you also listen to that in relation to this conversation, because today we're going to be talking about India's foreign policy, starting with the Prime Minister's visit to DC. He then went to Egypt, what's going on there. And then at the end, we'll also touch on where India-Pakistan relations stand and where they could go in the near future. Joining me today for this very special episode is Ashok Malik. He's a partner and chair of the New Delhi subsidiary for the Asia Group, also a colleague of mine. Ashok has vast experience looking at India's foreign policy, its economic and strategic posture in the region and beyond. Prior to joining the Asia Group, Ashok was serving as an advisor in the Ministry of External Affairs, working very closely with Dr. Jaishankar, who's the Foreign Minister of India. And Ashok also happens to be a colleague of mine, so this will be an on-record discussion of many things we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. Ashok, thank you so much for taking out the time, and welcome to Pakistonomy.
Thank you, Uzair. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for having me here.
Let's start with the trip. Narendra Modi comes to Washington. It's a state visit. He becomes one of the very few leaders in history to have twice addressed a joint session of Congress in Washington, D.C. But there was a lot of noise before and after the trip itself. Bad bet on India. Is India ever going to be an ally of the United States? Well, India is buying Russian oil. It's trying to play both camps. Help us decipher the signal from the noise here. What was the significance of this trip? And what are some things people should be aware of moving forward?
I think this trip proved more than almost anything else that the commentary and the analysis of the India-US relationship is actually way behind the trajectory the two governments have put together for this bilateral relationship. I don't think in government they're seriously bothered about what is an ally and who is a partner and where alliances end and partnerships begin. Those semantics, those uh, details, which are really so 20th century in a time of such dynamism and very, very different relationships. India is never going to be an ally, or not for the foreseeable future, not going to be an ally in the sense that the US had allies in the 1950s or 60s. For one, India doesn't depend on the US for its immediate military security. If a country attacks in India, if India runs into a warlike situation with China, which it has faced over the past 2 years, or with any other neighbor, quite frankly, including Pakistan, it's not that US troops or the US nuclear umbrella kicks in. Not at all. That's not the relationship. So. The expectations of the two countries have of each other are very, very different. Also, in terms of security, which is a key feature of this relationship, but not the only one. Military security has long been, I wouldn't say overshadowed, but been vastly complemented by concerns about technology and supply chains and how they fit into a broader national security architecture. And that is where India and the US see each other as extremely valuable. That is where this visit actually took the relationship much, much further. Uh, in in the normal course, an Indian Prime Minister visiting the US would try and tick one of many boxes. One, people to people and the cultural relationship. Two, a strategic and political alignment between the two governments and countries. Three, defense or military deals of some nature. Four, business partnerships, including investments from the US to India, and in some cases from India to the US, because it is now decidedly a two-way street. And fifth, of course, technology, because Technology incubation is something the Indian community contributes to in a big way in the US. Sharing technologies between two countries, co-producing these technologies, whether it is in advanced computing, whether it's in the quantum sphere, whether it's in the digital sphere, whether it's in climate change related technology. In all of those, the two countries can work together and are working together. This visit actually ticked all those boxes. It even had a diaspora element. It had an address to the U.S. Congress. It had a massive reception at the White House, at the lawns of the White House. So, in a sense, this visit was the grand slam. There was almost no element that was missing. Uh, it is apposite that this visit was just so big. It is, and possibly the biggest visit any Indian Prime Minister has had to the US in terms of optics as well as outcomes. It is apposite this has happened because of two or three reasons. One, if you look at his record, Narendra Modi is possibly the most bullish Prime Minister India's ever had on the India-US relationship. He's sold it domestically. He's taken it forward right from the time his government brought into effect the foundational agreements that really pushed the defense relationship, to going to America repeatedly, to inviting an American president to India's Republic Day celebrations. In every possible way, he's actually sold the relationship. Even with this visit, he's essentially tied India's economic and technological development with a deepening of his relationship with the United States. It's almost a one-to-one correlation that he's in effect achieved and messaged both in the US and in India. Uh, in terms of immediate outcomes, what this visit has done is that it's given very strong signal to business at a time when supply chains are being diversified. I'm not suggesting they're all being removed from China, but they are decidedly being diversified into several geographies or trusted geographies, if you will. They are being diversified for a number of reasons. One, because the old model of globalization, which led to a concentration of manufacturing supply lines, in particular in China and in that region, has created a pushback in many countries, including the US and India and many parts of the world. That's one reason. The second is what we saw with COVID, was that the concentration of supply lines, again in China, potentially could create bottlenecks, could create shortages of everything from masks to semiconductor chips across the world. Sometimes because of actions by the Chinese government or by a particular government, sometimes because of just the nature of the outcome of the pandemic and the lockdown. And third, of course, there's been a trust breakdown between several democracies, including the US and India for different reasons vis-a-vis China. This has led to concerns about what the Chinese are doing with key technologies, key emerging technologies, to which they have access. And this is creating some sort of a distinction in the minds of many countries, including the US and India, between trusted geographies or trusted countries and, well, not so trusted countries. So, given this, businesses are clearly taking signals from geopolitical messaging that governments are sending out before taking investment decisions. And the messaging coming out of this trip is that the US and India want to work much more closely together. So that messaging is being heard by companies not just in the US and in India, but quite frankly in third countries too, that want to be on the right side of these geographies. We've already seen Micron agreeing to invest in a semiconductor assembly and a packaging facility in near Ahmedabad in Gujarat in India. We've seen a decision taken by Tesla to seriously explore manufacturing in India. Other US companies, particularly in the computing, advanced materials, and manufacturing space, are also looking at India much more carefully. They're not looking at just India, they're looking at other countries as well. But India is a key part of their diversification story. The biggest success story so far, of course, has been that of Apple, which is doubling down on India and diversifying from its current factories in China. Uh, all of this process will be given and has been given a great impetus by this visit.
So that's a great overview, and I have a couple of follow-up questions. Let's start with the business side, right? A lot of interest. You mentioned Apple, Tesla, Micron, others taking the lead, but then India is also not a super easy place to do business, right? Particularly in relation to bureaucracy and some of the policies. Something that even on the Pakistan side of the conversation, talk about is there's a difference between import substitution and export promotion, right? The policy framework for those two things is very different. And at times we see bureaucracies in South Asia across the board go into this old import substitution lens. It's only for our market and will protect our market. As someone sitting in Delhi, what more would you like to see happen on the policy front to really take the signal and more aggressively convert it into a realizable opportunity on the India side, particularly on the manufacturing ecosystem perspective?
Uzair, I'd like to, since this is a deeper conversation, I'd like to give a slightly longer answer. Uh, any country with a deep and large domestic market, the US, India, uh, any other such geography, is going to leverage its domestic market to legitimately ask for a greater participation in manufacturing, to ask for some, not all, but some of the global value chains being moved or being placed in its own geography. Uh, the earlier model of simply outsourcing all manufacturing to wherever it was the cheapest or the most convenient for a particular transnational corporation to do it, and just sitting back and believing that when there is a shortage, goods will miraculously turn up, and that domestic society will automatically reorganize itself to live with an economy that has very little manufacturing. Uh, that model hasn't quite worked. It's led to economic discrepancies and shortfalls in times of crisis, or whether geopolitical crisis or a pandemic. It's also led to a political pushback. So, to some degree, countries such as India and the US, very different countries, very different economies. The US is many multiples of India's GDP, but both are looking at the domestic market and saying, look, you can't just have this for free. You have to give us something. So people being almost jealous of market access, that's a reality today. Uh, Second, there is a legitimate desire in India, it has been for some time, to push up manufacturing. This government says that it wants to push manufacturing from about 16% of uh, uh, $3 trillion GDP today, a little over $3 trillion today, to about 25% of a much larger GDP in about 10 years. Uh, it's it's a it's a tough ask, but it's a legitimate aspiration. Uh, Much of that, the incremental growth will come from electronics and mobile phones, computers, consumer electronics, and that space, because that is a space that is really growing. It will also come from defense manufacturing and its knockoffs and its collateral benefits. So those are areas India is looking at legitimately. It would also come from some niche, not niche, but some categories where India can easily scale up to become a key global supplier. This could be toys, for instance, which is, again, the government is looking at very carefully. Textiles is another area which should be an Indian strength, but for a variety of reasons, India lost out to countries such as Bangladesh, which actually were much cheaper. Because India is not always a cheap economy. So the push towards manufacturing, towards increasing the share of manufacturing in the GDP, in a much larger GDP, is legitimate, and it's also fairly determined. Uh, it's been attempted earlier without success, but I have not seen any government put in the sort of focus and energy into making it happen as this one has. Has it been successful entirely? No. But it's a work in progress, but decidedly there has been progress. Uh, Second, we need to ask ourselves, why has India not been a manufacturing power all these years? One of the reasons has been that, quite frankly, we haven't done factor market reforms in a way that we should have. There are many reasons for this. It's been politically difficult. People didn't attempt it. We can go into that history. And in some cases, you need to do it at the level of states rather than federally, or all of those points are well known and well taken. In a sense, what the production linked incentive program, which this government launched a few years ago, has done is it's given incentives to companies which have had legitimate complaints about India's absence of factor market reforms, and said, look, we recognize that this is an expensive place, sometimes an expensive place to manufacture. Here is an incentive for you to kickstart your manufacturing in India. It was not an incentive forever. It will be phased out in some time, but it's cash and an incentive for you to get started. And quite frankly, the PLI scheme is generous. It's also flexible. You talk about bureaucracy being a problem. Yes, it is a problem. I'm not denying that. We both, your country, your original country, Pakistan, and my country, India, have inherited the same
I
bureaucracy.
would add my adopted homeland, the United States, also has a crazy bureaucracy as
Well,
well.
all of us can blame the British, I guess. Uh, but for bureaucracy is nothing else. But the fact is, the PLI scheme, as this government has seen it, has been fairly flexible. It The government has, and individual civil servants and ministers have listened to feedback, have tweaked the policy for different categories. So there is a two-way process. Is it perfect, and is it that the government listens all the time? No, I'm not suggesting that. But there is a greater energy and a greater emphasis on pushing up manufacturing and genuinely trying to help business and international companies than ever before. Can it be improved? Of course it can. But the effort at the moment is markedly different from almost any such effort in the past few years, in the past few decades, I'd say, or since 1991 when we began our economic reform program. I have not seen this sort of a determined effort to push manufacturing ever before in my lifetime.
Yeah, no, it's been, and of course, Apple's entry and the interest from others is a testament to that those reforms and those incentives really channeling investment in the country. I want to switch to something else related to that trip, and would love your thoughts on it. Right, from my point of view, sitting in Washington, the prime minister comes, as you said, ticked all the boxes, big deals, technology transfer, all of that good stuff. And then 24 hours later, as he was going to Egypt, we saw in Russia the Wagner Group come within 200 kilometers of Moscow. And to me, that was a classic sort of like, if anything, the best signal ever, right? To domestic audiences in India that, hey, the bet is right. It's the prime minister's bullishness on the United States actually proving right after as he departs the United States. And as you said, there's a commentariat that is sort of behind the curve in terms of where this relationship is going. But then when I look at the media discourse, the social media discourse, it kind of got hijacked away from outcomes towards the react and response cycle related to questions asked by journalists or things that President Obama said, etc. Do you think that the discourse in India in particular missed that opportunity to really double down on where this relationship is going between the United States and India, and sort of got occupied in the noisy, rancorous debate of non-issues, essentially, in terms of where this relationship stands?
Look, again, let's step back and take a larger view of this. Some of the tweets that we saw, including from ministers and MPs, were very, very avoidable. I'm not denying that. But let's look at a broader picture. Uh, as far as I know, there are about 25 million Twitter users in India. Yeah, I could be wrong, but it's fairly obvious that the bet on America has a buy-in from a vast, vast majority of Middle India, which is much greater than its Twitter constituency or its Twitter uh, population. Let's presume everyone on Twitter is against this relationship, which is certainly not true. Even then, the number of the hundreds of millions of Indians who have a stake in the America relationship is far greater than 25 million, presuming all 25 million don't like the relationship. So let's not be distracted by the noise of Twitter. The relationship with America goes far beyond the Wagner Group or what's happening in Ukraine or Russia. Quite honestly, it's part of a reimagining of India's place in the world, going back to the 80s, I would say, and it's been accelerated in the past 20 years since the turn of the century. The post Pokhran nuclear test, rapprochement was one important milestone. Y2K was another important milestone. Uh, the the nuclear deal under Dr. Manmohan Singh was another milestone. And all, of course, Mr. Modi's administration has had several such milestones leading to this visit, leading to the deal that will see US jet engine technology being moved to India, being transferred to India, and jet engines being manufactured for Indian made fighter aircraft here. That's something
Which,
I've
fun
heard.
fact for the audience, in case people don't know, there are more countries in the world that know how to make nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors
Yeah.
than fighter jet engines in the world.
So that's a huge outcome, which I've forgotten to mention earlier. So has all of this happened? Why all of this has happened in parallel with a very deep people-to-people relationship. You walk into a restaurant in Delhi or Mumbai or Ahmedabad, and take a random poll of every table, and every table will have at least one person who has a cousin or a close relative living in America, working in America. This is a reality. This is a reality in almost all of India's big cities. Uh, so we there is a genuine empathy with America. There are personal relations. Somebody may have studied there. Somebody may have a business relationship there. Somebody may have traveled there. Uh, at the root of the India-US relationship is this very strong people-to-people bond, which middle-class India feels and buys into, and which Twitter cannot interrupt. Now, coming to Twitter and coming to, frankly, modern political messaging, whether in India or the US. This is, I began my life as a journalist many, many years ago. I gave up journalism about 20 years ago, full-time journalism. But I still think a lot about political communication.
I think you can never take out journalism out of a former journalist.
In a sense, yes, because it's a great profession to teach you about life and to teach you about many other professions. Also, it's a profession that is very alive to deadlines, so it keeps you on your toes. You can't postpone stuff to the next day or the next year, as bureaucracies do. You need to get it done by that deadline, by that evening. But political communication today, and especially in our social media age, has ceased to remain something you do to try and persuade the other person, to try and bring him or her closer to your point of view, to find some common ground. Okay, we disagree on 10 issues, maybe on these 2 issues we agree together. Most political communication on, say, social media has become virtue signaling. And it's become, my virtue signaling is more virtuous than yours. And people are addressing their base, their constituency, looking for validation. With due respects to President Obama, a person I respect deeply, his messaging on India, that interview with Christine Amanpour, was also addressing his constituency back home. A constituency which is skeptical about India, I agree, but he was addressing it. He made a very sweeping remark. I wish he had made a more specific remark that, look, these are the individual policies that worry me, or these are the issues and incidents that worry me. But he made a sweeping remark about the relationship between Hindus and Muslims in India, which I wondered whether a person of his maturity and experience should have. And then he spoke about India being potentially torn apart. I'm sure he didn't mean a territorial tearing apart. He meant more society's fabric being torn apart. But people in India did see it as a signal that India may actually break up. And again, I think President Obama should have been more sensitive to that, because this is a country that and this is a part of the world that has seen territorial challenges.
And I would add, if you may allow me, there's a history of Western press going back to 1947 onwards across the
True.
subcontinent, predicting the end of the nation states in the
So
subcontinent.
there are greater sensitivities here. And it now did it trigger a more than desirable backlash here? Yes, it did. I do wish some ministers and MPs had been a little more careful with their language while criticizing President Obama. But I guess they were also addressing their base. Uh, we reached an unfortunate situation where political messaging is now guided by what your base feels about your particular messaging on social media. This is a trap all politicians have fallen into. Politicians in India, politicians in the US as well, and in this case, President Obama. Uh, and we have to live with it.
Yeah, I think, again, I think, as I agree with your fundamental point, right, that the broader relationship in terms of the governments is far beyond and ahead of the curve than most imagine. So I think that's going to be the driving force, regardless of what happens in the near term. Switching gears, the prime minister comes to DC, then he immediately goes to Egypt. And there's a lot of interesting stuff happening on the India Middle East foreign policy side that, in my mind at least, a lot of people are not paying close attention to or appreciating the nuances. And I would love for you to sort of help the audience understand where you see that outreach going to, right? You've had deepening ties with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, with Israel, with the Haifa port. There's I2U2, a lot of things happening where, again, I would love for you to help the audience understand the signals from the noise here in terms of what India's Middle East strategy is at this point in time.
You know, my former boss, Minister Jaishankar, often describes India's contemporary foreign policy as one of concentric circles. And what this government, Mr. Modi's government, has done really is expanded the second concentric circle, or really invested in the second concentric circle. The first concentric circle is our immediate neighborhood, South Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, call it what you will. Well, just beyond that are the Gulf states, West Asia, as we call it. Uh, these are a part of our near neighborhood. It's often joked in India that Dubai is the most efficient and well-run Indian city, and Dubai Airport is the most efficient and well-run Indian airport.
And people from the subcontinent magically fall in line the moment they land in Dubai or
Absolutely,
Abu Dhabi airport.
absolutely, and things have changed, got a little complicated to our east, but frankly, Singapore still has a very important role to our east as well. So, in a sense, Singapore is the most efficient Indian airport to our east. But coming to the Gulf and West Asia, India has an important stake there. India has a large and very diverse diaspora there, from blue collar workers to white collar workers, from uh, business people to people who do more humble jobs on the streets of Dubai or Saudi Arabia. Uh, India also exports a lot to these countries. Food, for instance, the UAE's food supply lines depend heavily on India, and India kept those food supply lines going even during the COVID lockdown, just as the UAE looked after Indian workers, and even when they didn't really have work and incomes in that lockdown period. So both sets of countries really need each other. Also, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are reimagining the relationship with Israel. Uh, there is a lot of dynamism in that part of the world. Uh, Things are changing. As the role of the US contracts in that part of the world for many reasons. Say the US is contracting its commitments to many parts of Asia, including West Asia and the Gulf region. Uh, Partly this is because of pressures from uh, domestic society back home. Partly it's because the US is no longer dependent on energy from that part of the world. India is still dependent on energy from that part of the world. India still sees that part of the world as part of its neighborhood. And this has been there for 1,000 years, many thousand years. It's not new. And India has a diaspora that works there. India has economic ties with that part of the world. Investments from uh, sovereign wealth funds in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE coming into India, or whether it's Indian exports, pharmaceuticals, uh, now mobile phones, and as I said, uh, 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 food supplies to that part of the world. There's a strengthening relationship. So the investment in a deeper strategic relationship with the Gulf states and with West Asia was long overdue. Uh, it would also have a security and maritime dimension because India's maritime footprint is expanding. And as the US footprint declines or becomes smaller, uh, it will be filled by no one country can do it. No one country can replace the US or whatever the US is vacating, but India will be part of the mix. So, for all these reasons, Prime Minister Modi and his government have prioritized to reimagine the relationship with countries in what we call the Middle East or West Asia or North Africa. And of course, Egypt is, in a sense, a new frontier in the past few years. Uh, so that really is the reason why this relationship has been growing. Uh, I2U2 is a part of this as well because again, as the Israelis start working with their partners in the UAE or in other parts of the Arab world, uh, both countries want to work with India because they both have good relations with India, and they see India as an honest broker. And there are also economic opportunities for all three partners here. And of course, in the case of I2U2, the US is the fourth partner. There's a deep interest in all of these countries, including in Egypt, on what India has achieved with its digital public infrastructure, on how India has used uh, digital technology as a force multiplier to deliver public services to its people, to uh, enhance and accelerate its own developmental journey. So, for a vast variety of reasons, the relationship between India and broadly West Asia, North Africa, or the Middle East, as you folks call it in Washington, has got a significant boost in the past few years. I would argue it was waiting to happen. It's to the credit of Prime Minister Modi that he recognized the moment and seized it.
What are some things that, from your vantage point in Delhi, that you wish folks in Washington at least understood a bit better in terms of India's priorities, its strategic posture, and where it's trying to push the envelope in terms of its economic and foreign relations? Are there things that stand out to you that you're like, you know what, this is where folks in Washington perhaps need to understand things a bit better? I'm trying to understand what's the gap here, if any at all, that you think needs to be filled in terms of how the two communities, Delhi and Washington, understand each other.
To be honest with you, I think folks in government generally get it. Now, maybe that's true for the, the constellation of stars we have in Delhi and in Washington, because both governments, both the Biden administration and the Modi government here in Delhi, are blessed with unusually uh, sapient, I would say, and experienced foreign policy hands. India has not had a minister like Jaishankar. Uh, the Jaishankar Doval combination, uh, the, the the foreign policy team we have at the MEA, the enlightened and open thinking of the Prime Minister Modi, in reimagining India's place in the world. This is a unique set of characteristics. I'm not suggesting other prime ministers previously have not thought of foreign policy. They have, and they've thought well of it. But this cast of characters is very experienced and almost unique in their combination. Uh, in the US, too, the Biden administration has is fortunate that its foreign policy team, both in the NSCS and in the NSC and in state, and of course President Biden himself, uh, is again very, very experienced, and it's actually a team that has recognized India's strategic value and really invested in it. So I don't really have a problem with folks in government. Uh, the commentariat, the think tank community, and the media could cut India some slack. Uh, there are various sort of tactical and episodic issues on which I wish they understood India better, but I won't bore you with small incidents here and there. I think there should be a broader recognizing of the value of geography. Just as a century and more ago, almost 2 centuries ago, the US conceived the Monroe Doctrine because it was concerned about its backyard and its geography, South America, or actually even its west coast, being colonized by European powers, including, in fact, Russia. Just as geography matters to the US, geography matters to India also. That is why on, say, Myanmar, we will always take a different position from a country that is 1,000 miles away. So New Delhi's position on Myanmar will always be more nuanced and careful than Stockholm's position on Myanmar. Stockholm does not have Myanmar as a neighbor. India does. And India has a very long border with Myanmar. We have more than one state that has an insurgency that sometimes seeps into Myanmar. We have concerns about ethnic and religious conflict within Myanmar, which, if it goes out of hand, could create a very problematic situation at our doorstep. This is not a problem which the blob in Washington is concerned with, because for them, Myanmar is a black and white issue. Military junta versus whatever, non-military junta, democracy. We also value democracy, and we do want a democratically elected government in Myanmar. But life is more complicated than just that binary. The other area where geography really matters to us in a way that is not probably recognized in Washington is, frankly, what life looks like from the other side of this vast heartland called Eurasia. So what's happening in Ukraine is terrible, and Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is certainly not warranted, and nobody serious in government in India supports it. But the US and Europe's concerns are in the interaction with the Western world has with the western end of Eurasia. India's concerns are the eastern end of Eurasia, which is where Central Asia, China, Russia, Afghanistan, and India and Pakistan all meet. And that is a very troubling part of the world. That's a very troubled part of the world. That's a part of the world that has a direct bearing on India's security, India's, in some cases, India's economy, and India's stability. And that has been so for a long, long time. So, in a sense, geography defines your posture and your grand strategy. The US, US commentators get that in theory. They get that about their own country. They don't always get it about other countries.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And I would just add to it that on top of geography, there's a general weakness in the United States for history and understanding the long arc of history in Eurasia and the subcontinent in particular, because the US is a young country in the grand scheme of things, and therefore they don't have the memory of the 5,000, 10,000 years of civilizational history in that part of the world and the complications and nuances that then tends to create. You mentioned concentric circles, right? So we started with the US, came a bit closer to West Asia. I want to close this conversation with India, Pakistan, something you just mentioned as well. We've had false starts, many, many false starts. Nawaz Sharif on the Pakistani side perhaps is the only, I would say, politician to keep attempting peace and keep attempting at some sort of rapprochement and then falling short on that. The last attempt he made, 2014, with Prime Minister Modi, he came, everybody knows about what happened after that. And then we saw, and Imran Khan recently confirmed as well, that there was some opening during his tenure. And he, as commerce minister, said yes to trade, and then as prime minister said no to trade, which I still don't understand the logic of that, but let's ignore that for a point. I would love your thoughts on where this relationship stands today and what the attitude in Delhi is in terms of, at this point in time, figuring a way out to somehow, at least at a very base level, normalize relations with Pakistan. What's the Delhi perspective on Pakistan at this point?
Uh, when the Shahbaz Sharif government was sworn in, there was some hope that there would be some sort of a softening on trade from Pakistan's position, and people wondered where it could lead to. That didn't quite happen. Uh, I think Imran, as a politician, proved much more resilient and much more popular than a lot of people, including perhaps in Rawalpindi, imagined. And the situation in Pakistan has become that much more unpredictable. Uh, so there's a political meltdown, there's an economic meltdown, uh, and quite frankly, even if India wanted to talk, it doesn't know who to talk to right now. That is a reality. Perhaps the elections will give us greater clarity. But I would again step back from the immediate moment, and since you spoke about trade, uh, there's something for you to consider, for both India and Pakistan to consider. 1947 was a big rupture. It led to the creation of two different political entities and nation states. Now, frankly, that has happened earlier in history. It may happen again in history, in other geographies, other countries. Countries are formed, nation states are formed, nation states come together, they separate. This has been there throughout history in many parts of the world, from Africa, Europe, whatever. Uh, I would argue an even greater rupture that unfortunately took place because perhaps people didn't understand the value of economics and trade, was that uh, the world's largest free trade zone in an era before we understood what a free trade zone was and before we used words like or terms like FTA, uh, a free trade zone going back millennia, which brought goods and travelers and traders from Central Asia through Afghanistan, through what is today Pakistan, to what is today India, down to either Bengal or Myanmar or to the Indian Ocean. That got interrupted. Now, in a sense, Pakistan locked itself out of the rest of the subcontinent and hasn't quite found its way to a new uh, trade hinterland or a new geography, because that is the fundamental problem that Pakistan is grappling with. Because trade with Iran through the deserts of Balochistan is not quite the same thing as trade from one Punjab to the other and into the rest of India. There, uh, and of course, CPEC is one attempt to realign Pakistan's trade routes. Uh, it's decidedly a work in progress, and let's see where that goes. In the case of India, with India's much larger geography, with India's access to its peninsula, with India's access to its east and countries to its east, uh, India reimagined its trade map. And then, of course, technology has helped it trade beyond South Asia, beyond the subcontinent, with as I said, with ASEAN, with West Asia, and with America. Uh, when a young Indian today thinks of Pakistan, uh, he thinks of it in the context of a cricket match. He may think of it in the context of uh, some violent incident, a terror incident, or something of that nature. Uh, but he doesn't think of it as a place he would want to travel to, because travel doesn't happen. He doesn't think of it a place where he may want to go and study, because that doesn't happen. He will not think of it a place where he may want to go and work, or sell some goods or sell his services, because that doesn't happen. We're not part of the same trading system. Now, when the young person in India thinks of Dubai, or thinks of Singapore, or thinks of whatever, Seattle, or the Netherlands, or the UK, one or many of these motivations come into play. He or she thinks of studying there, or going there to work, or thinks of that particular city or country as a location where Indians either export something, or from where they import something. With Pakistan, none of those very normal everyday trade linkages come into play. And this is leading to a, a rupture of a far deeper kind. It's not hostility, because when you don't know something, you can't either like it or hate it. You just simply don't know about it. It's leading to a rupture, not of hostility but of ignorance. And unless we fix those trade linkages, quite frankly, and I guess this is a question to be posed to governments in Islamabad more than governments in New Delhi, because governments in New Delhi have tried, to be honest. Uh, unless we fix this this almost passive rupture will just keep growing.
Do you see, like, if I were to then ask you, let's say, elections in Pakistan are coming up, we kind of know what the makeup of this will be given everything that's happened to the PTI, and, by hook or by crook. And then there's the electoral cycle in India in 24. If I were to say, okay, if there's an opening on either side, on the Delhi side, in terms of the prime minister looking at reimagining foreign policy and sort of saying, look, there is some opening here. The World Cup you mentioned is also coming up, which, by the way, a lot of people would want to travel to India for. And then on the Pakistani side, there's a government that, historically, at least on the People's Party and Nawaz League side, has also been committed to peace and has been undermined in many ways. What would it take to create that opening, if I were to ask you, as sort of where your foreign policy had across on both sides? And what would you like to see happen that would tell you, okay, you know what, maybe there's a slight opening once more that, we can push through and sort of get something done?
I don't have an answer, to be honest with you, because a lot of it would depend on the issues and themes that come up in the election in Pakistan. To what degree is the election about economic rebuilding? To what degree is the election about identity, uh, politics, and an issue such as India or Kashmir, and so on? Uh, it depends on that, to be honest with you. If there is a genuine conversation with Pakistani politicians are willing to have with the people of Pakistan about focusing on the economy, and focusing on uh, you know that what is the big debate that people in the UK are not having? Their politicians are not telling them that Brexit was a stupid idea, because you can't not trade with your immediate neighbor and think of trade deals with countries which are thousands of miles away while not trading with the immediate neighbor. Uh, in a sense, that's the conversation with Pakistani politicians have to have with the people of Pakistan. It's just the same thing.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, my fun fact when I go to Islamabad is to pull up the Google satellite map and basically draw the geography of the region and say, well, or you pull up the night lights from NASA and say, well, this is the trade corridor right here. It's lit up at night. And if you're ignoring that, and if you think you can somehow magically trade into Central Asia, or into the Xinjiang region or into Iran, then history doesn't support that idea, and geography most certainly does not. And there's a reason why history is important, and the region has always traded. You mentioned the rupture, right? I mean, my own grandfather used to trade from Gujarat all the way to Chittagong. And then it was Karachi to Chittagong, and then it just was Karachi at the end of the day, towards the end of his life. So I saw this play out in my own lifetime in terms of his stories and how he could trade and what flowed through this subcontinent. And I agree. I think if trade happens, then those linkages begin. There's constituencies for peace and normalization, and we build that forward. But unfortunately, that's not the case right now. And you're right. There's a generational shift happening. So I think maybe the old hats on either side of the border will try to rescue that situation and birth a new generation of peaceniks in the region. But on that note, Ashok, thank you so much for taking out the time for this. It was fascinating conversation, and always learn a lot from you. And thank you for coming on the podcast, and we'll be in touch soon as well.
Thank you, Uzair. This has gone extremely well. I've enjoyed doing this. I hope you had as much fun as I did. Thanks for having
I
me.
did. Thank you. Bye bye.